for joining us. Here's a look at the stories that we're watching right now.
I'm calling on Congress to suspend the federal gas tax for the next 90 days through the busy summer season.
President Biden pushing a federal gas tax holiday following the lead of some governors. How much it stands to actually save drivers and when it could go into effect. Plus, after a bipartisan deal on Capitol Hill, there's criticisms from both sides that the new gun legislation either does too little or too much. We're live on the Hill with the latest. And the fallout from a damning assessment of law enforcement's response to the mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas. Now, Uvalde's mayor is suing law enforcement, citing a lack of transparency and accusing them of minimizing failures. And a California man pleads not guilty to attempting to assassinate Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. How much time he could actually potentially spend behind bars if convicted. And on the same day, Republican officials from Georgia testified about former President Trump's efforts to upend the 2020 election. Voters there issue a rebuke to Trump-endorsed candidates. We begin tonight with President Biden putting his support behind a federal gas tax holiday. He's asking Congress to potentially lift around 18 cents per gallon for 3 months. A number of states have already passed such measures, including Connecticut and Georgia. During a speech today, the president called on oil companies to lower the high prices.
So let's be honest with one another. My message is simple. To the companies running gas stations and setting those prices at the pump, this is a time for global peril, Ukraine. These are not normal times. Bring down the price you are charging at the pump to reflect the cost you are paying for the product.
For more on this, Francesca Chambers and Skylar Henry join me now. Francesca is senior White House correspondent at McClatchy, and Skylar is CBS News reporter covering Capitol Hill. Great to see you both. Thanks for being here. So we have the White House and Capitol Hill covered here. Francesca, though, I want to start with you because President Biden says a federal gas tax holiday will help families with paying at the pump. Take a listen.
By suspending the 18-cent gas tax, federal gas tax, for the next 90 days, we can bring down the price of gas and give families just a little bit of relief. I call on the companies to pass this along, every penny of this 18-cent reduction to the consumers. There's no time now for profiteering.
So, Francesca, if you rewind back to 2008 and a similar situation, high gas prices and the economy was kind of in a tailspin, you had then candidate Obama calling this very same thing, the gas tax holiday, a political gimmick designed to get votes. So saving 18 cents a gallon, is this really a move more about political optics at this point?
Well, even as recently, Caitlin, as this weekend, we heard administration officials sound lukewarm on this idea. Secretary Granholm, who we heard from today, seemed skeptical of a gas tax holiday. But yet we heard the president today say that he was giving it his full-throated endorsement and calling on Congress to pass it. So it's not clear, Caitlin, what changed in the last few months since lawmakers, including those within the president's party, decided to begin pushing for this. It's not clear what caused the president to change his mind, other than perhaps the high prices at the pumps.
Yeah, and interesting to hear Granholm say, too, that, look, this tax pays for things like infrastructure and other items, so it does create some questions about where that revenue would come from. But, Skylar, you know, the president can only do so much unilaterally. I mean, essentially, Congress has to vote to actually put a tax holiday in effect. Does he have the votes to do that on Capitol Hill?
Well, to use Francesca's words, lukewarm at best is probably the reception to all of this in the last few, let's call it days, and obviously with the president's call earlier today. I think even from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who was essentially non-committal about it, but said that she would bring it back to the caucus to see where they stand. We've seen others within the party come out to say that they realize the president's intentions, well-intentioned, but really that the effects of all of this would be minuscule, if you will, in terms of what consumers and those drivers who actually have to go to the pump and are seeing those skyrocketing prices in terms of what they will have to deal with. And as you mentioned, this takes away from some of the funding that would be part of that bipartisan infrastructure deal in terms of repairing some of those crumbling roads and bridges and things like that. And so a lot of Democrats are concerned about what this could potentially do. But we've already heard from Republicans on the Hill on this issue. Senator John Thune of South Dakota essentially said that this would be dead on arrival if something like this were to come, saying that really this is a Band-Aid solution for a bigger problem. And I think lawmakers on both sides of the issue say that this tax holiday, if you will, would essentially be a Band-Aid short-term fix when really there needs to be something done to address the root of the problem.
Yeah, really interesting dynamic there, especially since it's not yet clear that the gas tax wouldn't be passed on to the consumer in some way. That's a big concern as well. Francesca, so we have gas prices up, but the president's approval rating is down. It's around 40%. What conversations are being had at the White House about how to boost these numbers?
Well, and in the latest USA Today Suffolk poll, it was at 39%, Caitlin. And so you have seen the White House respond to that with measures like what the president has announced today, a gas tax holiday. The White House had said that they were considering a rebate, potentially a rebate card. The president said that over the weekend. They said they have no update on that today, Caitlin, but it all points in the direction of the White House saying that they understand inflation and the economy is the top thing on voters' minds as they head into the November election, and trying to look like their president is doing everything that he can to fix it. The Energy Secretary Granholm will be meeting with the energy companies, the oil and gas companies tomorrow to pass on the president's message that they should find, quote, creative, unquote, solutions to try and bring down prices for consumers. Now, what the administration specifically wants to see them do, that's also unclear at this time, and what it would take for the president to be satisfied and not take executive action, as the White House has also indicated he could do. We also just don't know the answer to yet.
Yeah, I mean, another big headline this week, in addition to the economy, is this legislation on gun reform. And I want to ask both of you about it. But Skylar, I want to talk with you about it first, because you have been on Capitol Hill covering the drafting of this legislation. In the early draft, what made it in and what didn't?
Well, in this bipartisan deal that was announced yesterday and passed through those procedural votes, this would include things like expanding background checks, especially to those under 21, looking into juvenile and mental health records for starters. They would also incentivize states for enforcing what's referred to as red flag laws that would allow courts to temporarily remove firearms from individuals deemed a danger to themselves or to those around them. And then it also closes what's referred to as the boyfriend loophole, and that would allow or prevent partners convicted of domestic abuse living outside of the home from preventing a fire or from owning a firearm. It also includes millions of dollars in investments for mental health, also school safety and security as well. These are things that lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have agreed on, but there has been some pushback on these measures. On one hand, some lawmakers are saying that this is doing too much. We already saw from Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky have concerns about those red flag laws and say that he is going to propose several amendments on that. And just in the past hour, California Democrat Dianne Feinstein has said that she would be introducing an amendment as well, raising the age for those being able to have access to semi-automatic rifles from 18 to 21, language that we've heard before and definitely included in measures that have passed in the House but have been yet to be introduced in the Senate. And so I think the final language of this bill is going to be what is really going to be grounds for contention, especially if they're going to try to get the necessary votes needed in order for this measure to pass. We have heard from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who said that if and when this measure passes through the Senate, then they will vote on it. And even if you voted down party lines, it would presumably pass in that measure. We should also point out that House Republican Tony Gonzalez, who represents Uvalde, Texas, said that he is going to vote for this measure, especially after what happened in Uvalde last month, where 19 children and 2 teachers were killed. And so I think that measure will pass. But I think the big question right now, Caitlin, will be what the final language of this bill will look like.
Skylar, that's really interesting to hear from that Republican congressman in Uvalde because he had been so resistant to any changes to gun laws. So the fact that he's supporting this does show maybe there might be some other Republicans who jump on board. But, you know, do you have a sense of the timeline about when this actually might pass? I mean, they've wanted to pass it before the July 4th recess. Is that still possible?
Well, it's possible. Majority Leader Schumer said that he'd like to see something done by the end of the week. We've heard similar sentiments from Dick Durbin and others who say that they are going to stay here until these measures are passed. But I think it'll be interesting to see how these amendments will be voted on moving forward, if they change any of the language of this bill, because remember, this is so fragile. They need every single, and by they, Democrats need every vote that they can, those 10 Republican votes, in order for a measure like this to pass. So one has to wonder if language changes from that bipartisan agreement, does that take some of those votes away? And I think they've talked about lawmakers who've negotiated on this deal. They've talked about the fragility of these negotiations over the past few days and weeks. And so one has to wonder, if something were to be included, does that take away a Republican vote? Do you try to get another person to hop on board? And I think that is going to be something that a lot of Democrats, especially Chris Murphy, who's leading the charge in these negotiations, are thinking about as they move through with all of this.
An ever-fragile coalition indeed. Francesca, of course, this, if it does pass, would be a victory for President Biden when he desperately needs one. But what else is on the agenda in the coming week that you're paying particular attention to?
Well, President Biden will be heading at the end of this week, early next week on Saturday, to Europe for a trip to meet with G7 leaders, but also the NATO alliance, Caitlin. And on the topic there, they will be largely discussing Ukraine and Russia's war on Ukraine. This initially, the G7 summit, had been supposed to be focused on climate change initiatives, some of those that the president said long-term could bring down energy prices and food costs. But now, because of the Russian war against Ukraine, that will be the top topic for leaders. And they are expected to have key conversations around sanctions and whether or not they could increase those. They're also expected to talk about food shortages worldwide and how to get grain out of Ukraine. Another key topic that we expect them to talk about is just the future of the war itself, but also rebuilding in Ukraine that will need to take place after it's all over. So weighty topics facing world leaders this weekend.
A very long to-do list for the president. Francesca Chambers and Skylar Henry covering both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue for us. We really appreciate your time in reporting. The results are in from the most recent round of primaries, the takeaway, the defining issues, and how the 2020 presidential election factored in. Plus, an update on the armed man who was apprehended near Justice Brett Kavanaugh's home, and more on how the incident has changed security protocols. You're streaming Red and Blue.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like, wow.
Big rewards.
There's gold in them, there are hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's gonna bounce back. It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
This week on 60 Minutes,
That's incredible.
The 60 Minutes.
60 minutes. 60 minutes.
Are you ready for some tough questions?
Let me ask you this.
you know how this sounds.
What's your response to that?
60 Minutes Sundays on CBS.
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel. Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy. And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Tom.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun. But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking.
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
Innovative and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yeah. We found it.
You're kidding me!
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
In a blow to former President Trump's perceived power over Republican candidates, 2 of his chosen challengers lost in Georgia's GOP congressional runoffs yesterday. In Georgia's 10th congressional district, businessman Mike Collins beat Vernon Jones by nearly 50 points. And in the 6th congressional district, Rich McCormick received more than double the votes as Jake Evans. Stephen Fowler is with me now. He's a politics reporter for Georgia Public Broadcasting and the host of the Battleground Ballot Box podcast, and of course, a friend of the program. Stephen, good to see you. Thanks for being here. So many of these contests have been framed as a referendum on former President Trump's endorsement power. Why isn't that the case in Georgia, however?
Well, I think you have to look at what's been happening in Georgia since 2020, and that's Trump and a lot of candidates aligned with Trump focusing on the 2020 presidential race, focusing on the past, focusing on false claims of election fraud, and Republican voters in Georgia are by and large past that. You know, the biggest indicator here is Governor Brian Kemp, who was a very popular governor, maybe the most conservative governor Georgia's ever had in history. And when Trump set his sights on Kemp, after all of the deliverables that Kemp had for Republicans, like lowering taxes and increasing teacher pay and other things like that, it kind of set off this shift of like, well, wait a minute, maybe Donald Trump's word isn't the end all be all that maybe it was before.
Certainly a big blow to his endorsements, or wanting to see Georgia as a place to revenge some of these people from 2020. But I do want to turn to the Secretary of State race because, of course, Brad Raffensperger has become kind of a household name at this point. And in November, he's now going to be facing off a Democratic challenger, Bee Nguyen, who won her primary last night. What's the status of this race? How is it shaping up? And does Brad Raffensperger's testimony yesterday in the January 6th hearing, will it feature at all or factor in that contest?
Well, it certainly makes the race more interesting because one of the biggest benefits for Democrats in the campaign that they're raging this fall was to try to say, look, the Republicans are the party of Donald Trump. They're the party of election deniers. But the primaries didn't quite pan that out. And so here you have Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger testifying on a national stage about how he stood up to Trump and how he defended the election results and defended against death threats. And so it makes the dynamics of the race a little more or a little less about 2020 and claims of election fraud. But now Democrats like Bee Nguyen, the state lawmaker who did win the Democratic primary nomination, still say that even though Raffensperger stood up to Trump in 2020, they don't trust him to do it again. And they say other actions he's taken as Secretary of State kind of undermines what he did in that one particular moment.
Very interesting to keep an eye on how that race pans out. Georgia also is home to some highly competitive races for governor and the Senate this cycle. How are these national themes like the economy and inflation kind of playing into the political dynamics there? I mean, it is interesting that you have Kemp trying to, run on his record in the governor's race, but then you have someone like Herschel Walker running in the Senate race and trying to make this a referendum essentially on Biden.
It is an interesting duality here. I mean, Georgia is a state that obviously is dominating the national political discussion. So what goes on in Washington and what goes on in Atlanta and around the state are tied very closely hand in hand. But you're right, Governor Brian Kemp is touting Georgia's record low unemployment, its record budget surpluses, all of these things at the local level that don't quite match up with a lot of the national conversation against the Biden administration, against inflation, against gas prices. And so it does put a candidate like Herschel Walker in a bit of a pickle because, for example, there's Republican opposition to the gas tax holiday that President Biden is proposing, but Governor Brian Kemp passed a state sales gas tax that is very popular and very well received. So you really have this duality of, how much of national politics will drive Georgia voters versus how much is what people see when they walk outside of their front door.
Yeah, I was thinking about Kemp passing that gas tax holiday or signing that because you have Republicans on Capitol Hill here in Washington who are saying that they don't want to go forward with this. This is a gimmick, essentially, what Biden is suggesting. So it'll be interesting to see kind of state versus national how this plays out. And I know you covered Georgia, of course, but I do have a question about another state because there was a big race in Alabama last night, a Republican primary. You had Mo Brooks, who, of course, encouraged Trump supporters ahead of the Capitol riot on January 6th to fight. He eventually lost the endorsement from former President Trump after he had received it initially. Remind us what happened.
Well, Donald Trump likes to pick winners, and Georgia notwithstanding, Mo Brooks' campaign was not looking like a winner in Alabama. Katie Britt, a more establishment candidate, was doing very well. So Trump rescinded the endorsement from Brooks and also gave it over to Britt. And so at the end of the day, Donald Trump still did win, regardless of who was going to win the Alabama Senate nomination. But like you see in Georgia and many of the other primaries, that really voters picked the best candidate that they thought was for them in their state. And it just so happened in this case, Trump's endorsement lined up with it.
All right, Stephen Fowler, we like to say that Georgia is the center of the political universe always. So thank you for your time. Appreciate your reporting.
Thank you.
In addition to Georgia, 3 other states also held primaries on Tuesday. Katie Britt won the Republican primary for U.S. Senate in Alabama against Mo Brooks. The Trump-backed candidate defeated Mo Brooks in a runoff election. Brooks, as we mentioned, lost his endorsement from the former president after lagging behind in the polls. Britt will face Democrat Will Boyd in the November general election. In Washington, D.C., Mayor Muriel Bowser won the Democratic mayoral nomination. She defeated council members Robert White and Trayon White, who criticized her response to rising crime rates in the city. If Bowser wins the general election, she'll become the second D.C. mayor to win 3 consecutive terms. And in Virginia, Yesli Vega won the Republican primary in the 7th district. She prevailed over 5 Republican candidates, and she'll face off against Democratic Representative Abigail Spanberger. If Vega wins in November, she will become the first Latina congresswoman in Virginia's congressional delegation. The man accused of attempting to murder Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh was arraigned in Maryland court today. 26-year-old Nicholas John Roski faces a federal charge of attempted murder. He was taken into custody earlier this month after traveling to Kavanaugh's Maryland home with multiple weapons. Roski told authorities that he was upset the leaked Supreme Court document draft opinion to overturn abortion rights and the recent shooting at Robb Elementary School in Texas. His jury trial is set to begin August 23rd. So for more on this, let's bring in CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge. Hey, Catherine, good to see you. Thanks for being here. So Roski was back in court today after his initial appearance on June 8th. What did we learn today?
Well, Caitlin, this was very much a procedural hearing. It lasted about 15 minutes. Our editorial producer, Jillian Morley, was inside the courtroom and reports to us that the defendant wore a maroon jumpsuit. He was doubled over for most of the hearing and at times was wringing his hands or holding his head in hands, sort of reflecting that nervousness and anxiety. He entered a plea of not guilty. What Jillian Morley told us is that the charge actually now is attempting to assassinate a Supreme Court justice. And as you mentioned, they've set a very speedy timetable for a trial, August 23rd, Caitlin.
And Catherine, we know that Roski arrived at Justice Kavanaugh's Maryland home very early in the morning with a bag of potential weapons and tools to actually break into the house. What can you tell us about the items that police recovered from him?
Well, just to reset for folks at home, based on the court records and the Justice Department documents, it's alleged that Roski arrived outside Justice Kavanaugh's home, which is just outside of the Washington, D.C. area in Maryland, in the early morning hours around 1 a.m. And then he started to pace the block. It was shortly after that he called 911, said that he wanted to assassinate a Supreme Court justice. And then all of these items were recovered, and they include a tactical vest, a knife, a pistol, as well as ammunition, in addition to a hammer, items that could have been used to break into the home as well. And the reason all of that matters is that it goes to this issue of premeditation, and that is why one of the most serious charges has been brought against him.
Wow, very scary stuff. And the Montgomery County Police Chief told reporters that Roski actually texted his sister from outside Justice Kavanaugh's house, and she was the one that convinced him to call 911. What do we know about what he told her and authorities after he was arrested?
Well, this is one of the most interesting elements of the case. We were able to confirm late this afternoon that the Montgomery County Police Chief did tell reporters that he was aware of these text messages between the defendant and a member of the family. We believe it was the sister, and that in those text messages, he indicated that he planned to assassinate a Supreme Court justice and then commit suicide. And this went on for several minutes, and that it was actually the family member, in this case the sister, that convinced him to call 911. And it was that call to 911 that minutes later led to his arrest and then the recovery of all those items that we mentioned. So not only weapons, but also articles that could have been used to break into Justice Kavanaugh's home.
And we know that he has pleaded not guilty, but what kind of sentence could he face if he was convicted?
Well, this is another curious part of the investigation. Shortly after he was arrested, Caitlin, he was interviewed by detectives in Maryland. He essentially waived his rights to have an attorney present. And it was in the course of that interview, he said he had gone to Justice Kavanaugh's home because he was upset about the leak of the Supreme Court draft that indicated the court would overturn Roe v. Wade. And then also, as you mentioned earlier, he was very upset about the mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas. So this is self-incriminating statements that were made to investigators after he was told his legal rights. So that gives him a very difficult legal avenue to try and negotiate. He could get life in prison if he's convicted on this charge of attempting to assassinate a Supreme Court justice. So there's significant evidence of premeditation. Now we have what appear to be voluntary statements that he made, which implicate himself in the crime. And then again, this very serious charge. And since, I think it's worth noting, we've had legislation moving through the House and Senate to ramp up 24-hour protection for Supreme Court justices, not only themselves, also their family members and other judges on the federal bench who they think may be at risk and facing threats as we go forward.
Indeed, very unfortunately timely. Catherine Herridge, thank you so much for your reporting.
Welcome.
We appreciate it. A lawsuit from state and local officials demanding access to records related to law enforcement's response to the Uvalde school massacre. We'll speak to a former FBI special agent who literally wrote the book on active shooter training after the Sandy Hook school massacre on what should have happened. Plus, a deadly earthquake rocks a remote region of Afghanistan. What we know about the casualties and the rescue efforts in the war-ravaged country. You're streaming CBS News.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy.
and reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Tom.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun.
But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like, wow.
Big rewards.
There's gold in them, there hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's gonna bounce back. It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
This week on 60 Minutes, that's incredible.
The 60 minutes.
60 minutes, 60 minutes.
Are you ready for some tough questions?
Let me ask you this.
You know how this sounds.
What's your response to that?
60 Minutes Sundays on CBS.
Welcome back to Red and Blue. Here's a look at some of our top stories. President Biden is calling on Congress to enact a federal gas tax holiday for 3 months. If it passes, it would save Americans roughly 18 cents a gallon. Plus, the Biden administration is importing 16 million bottles of baby formula from Mexico to help ease the national shortage. The so-called Operation Fly formula has now brought in some 32 flights of much-needed product from all over the world. And Congress is inching closer to passing legislation to address gun violence. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says lawmakers aim to pass the Safer Communities Act by the end of the week, despite disagreements from both sides. State and local officials in Texas are suing the state's Department of Public Safety over access to records involving the response to the mass shooting at a Uvalde elementary school last month. The suit was announced just ahead of testimony from Texas Department of Public Safety Director Stephen McCraw at a state Senate hearing. McCraw's testimony outlined several failures with law enforcement's response, calling it an abject failure.
There's compelling evidence that the law enforcement response to the attack at Robb Elementary was an abject failure and antithetical to everything we've learned over the last 2 decades since the Columbine massacre. 3 minutes after the subject entered the West Building, there was a sufficient number of armed officers wearing body armor to isolate, distract, and neutralize the subject. The only thing stopping a hallway of dedicated officers from entering room 111 and 112 was the on-scene commander, who decided to place the lives of officers before the lives of children.
But on Wednesday, Uvalde Mayor Don McLaughlin said McCraw has continued to, quote, lie, leak, mislead, or misstate information in order to evade responsibility. Catherine Schweit is a retired FBI special agent. She created an active shooter training for the agency following the mass shooting at Connecticut's Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012. She's also the author of Stop the Killing, How to End the Mass Shooting Crisis, and co-host of the Stop the Killing podcast. Catherine, great to see you. Thanks for being here. Perfect person to talk to about this, because based on what you've seen and heard so far, would you agree with McCraw's assessment?
Well, I think the frustrating part for me, having been in this business for too long, is that right now we have a lack of transparency from the departments, all the departments involved. And because of that, we're getting a lot of mudslinging. Police officers aren't used to having what they say at a press conference questioned. So the lack of transparency, which is going to come out, all these facts are going to come out. Certainly, I think more of what you're hearing from Texas DPS is closer to the truth than what you might be hearing from the chief of the school district right now. But definitely there were tons and tons of failures that everybody can point to. But I think who's culpable and how culpable everybody is, we're still going to have to run those facts down.
Yeah, there are so many upsetting layers to this, and it just seems like every day that we're getting more information and conflicting information, the more upsetting it is for those parents especially. But, according to the active shooter training that you created for the FBI, what actually should happen in the first few minutes when law enforcement officers arrive on a scene like Uvalde? What should happen?
Well, the FBI plus plenty of other good law enforcement agencies since the Columbine shooting have had a very clear and consistent direction for law enforcement when they go into a scene where someone is shooting in this type of a way. It's a very clear directive. They are to enter, find the person who is doing this or the people doing this, neutralize the shooter, then move to the survivors to stop the deaths, right, and take command of the scene. It's a really clear law enforcement 101 that clearly did not happen here.
And having a specially designed department, dedicated to school protection is not particularly common, but Robb Elementary School had one in place. So after the shooting, do you think that there's going to be a reassessment of actually who makes the decisions in a mass school shooting?
In law enforcement, the person who arrives on the scene first is the one who's considered to be the incident commander until circumstances change. Somebody else comes in, another department comes in. But this was a police chief of the school district, so they would have had priority in terms of being and maintaining their incident command. But I think you raise a better question. Something that raises my concerns is Texas itself has more than 300 primarily small law enforcement departments that just represent schools. And I think it's time to evaluate there in Texas and across the country, are the smaller departments ones that maybe could serve their community better if the political components that own them would make a decision to contract with a larger organization, a county, a state patrol, the county sheriff's office, to perhaps provide better, more comprehensive group of training and a group of opportunities for the law enforcement officers involved.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, especially federally and locally. Lawmakers are trying to figure out ways to kind of beef up school security and safety. You are a retired law enforcement officer. So given that, and as someone who designed these active shooter training, in the wake of Sandy Hook, you're meant to train for the worst case scenario, of course. But what needs to change in that kind of preparation and training after yet another mass shooting?
Well, I think it's twofold. What needs to train for law enforcement is they need to be better and consistent in their training. I think the law enforcement and the vast number of law enforcement officers at this scene, we will find had the proper training, knew what to do, and then what they didn't do is execute. So the training changes have to talk about execution and whether or not, even if the person is with you is not following through on the training as it's designed, you need to go ahead and do that. I think one of the things that we saw up in Minnesota, where we had an officer who was pinning a black man down, and that black man, eventually that officer was convicted of murdering him, and the other officers who stood by and didn't intercede, literally pushed that officer off of that gentleman's neck. Those officers also face criminal charges. So I think that's the challenge for law enforcement is you've got to follow your training, but you also have to protect human life. That's your prime directive, is to protect human life.
Absolutely. And still so many upsetting questions and lots of answers that we still need to get in the situation in Uvalde. Catherine Schweit, thank you so much for your expertise and for being here with us.
Thanks.
More than 1,000 people have been killed and 1,500 injured after a powerful earthquake hit Afghanistan. The magnitude 5.9 earthquake struck the eastern province of Paktika Wednesday morning. Officials say the number of casualties is expected to rise as rescue efforts continue. Many international agencies have left Afghanistan since the Taliban took over, leading the UN to request relief from other nearby countries. Will he or won't he? Former President Trump continues to tease a potential 2024 White House bid. But the timing of a potential announcement is causing some angst for members of his own party. Why that is and what it may mean for the midterms. You're streaming Red and Blue.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital.
We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News.
What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Whether former President Donald Trump will jump into the 2024 presidential race is still an open question. According to a new article in the conservative-leaning Washington Examiner, top Republicans are worried that he might enter the race before this year's midterms. They're concerned that a Trump run this early might rev up turnout among Democrats. So for more, let's bring in Daviducker. David is senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner and the author of In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. Hey there, David. So good to see you. Thanks so much for being here, and perfect timing to talk with this book because of everything going on. As you know from covering Trump for a while, playing coy about whether or not he'll run for office has been kind of classic Trump. For example, listen to what he said at CPAC last year.
With your help, we will take back the House, we will win the Senate, and then a Republican president will make a triumphant return to the White House. And I wonder who that will be. I wonder who that will be. Who will that be? I wonder.
I wonder who that'll be. Well, I mean, are there any foreseeable issues that you see for Trump to mobilize campaign staff? And is he able to tap into this kind of massive election war chest that he's amassed since the election?
Yeah, Caitlin, it's a really fascinating question. I mean, the thing about it is no other Republican or Democrat would think of announcing a campaign. There would not even be speculation about announcing a campaign before midterm elections, especially midterm elections where their party was positioned for major gains and a takeover of the House and Senate and possibly state houses and governor's mansions across the country. They'd want to keep all eyes on that effort, all investments into that effort, and they wouldn't want to be a distraction. And Donald Trump is very polarizing, so as much trouble as President Biden is having, as low of an opinion as voters have of him right now, President Trump launching a campaign in the middle of this midterm election cycle is not what Republicans want to see, because they want all eyes on Biden. They want to focus on that, and they do not want to dilute the message. I tend to think, Caitlin, that while I always believe the speculation, because you can never discount this idea, as you mentioned, that Donald Trump is not going to do the thing that nobody else would do, that he's not in a hurry, or any more of a hurry than he needs to be, to file financial disclosure with the Federal Election Commission, to disengage from his super PAC and not be able to raise money directly and coordinate directly with his super PAC, to have to rely on all of those hard dollars, meaning the FEC limits that say how much you can raise, that prohibit you from coordinating with outside groups that are supporting you. And I think the longer that Trump can do all of that and continue to rake in dough, and that's what he's been doing for the past couple of years, I think the happier he will be and the more likely he is to do that. The only caveat here is he does seem, I don't know if the word is nervous, but he doesn't like it when there is a suggestion that voters might consider other Republicans other than him, and the idea of boxing them out, I'm sure, is on his mind.
That's fascinating. And I mean, one way, obviously, to raise money is to say, I'm thinking about running for president again. I mean, one person who wants to be very focused on the midterms right now is Rick Scott, who, of course, is the National Republican Senatorial Chairman. He needs to get Republicans elected to take over the majority. I attended a breakfast with him earlier today at Reporters Roundtable, and he said that he talks to Trump every couple of weeks, and he expects him to run. I'm wondering, what else may be factoring into this decision from Trump? And do you get the sense that there are, Republicans running for office right now who would like the attention to be on them and not so much on him?
Well, look, I think Trump wants everybody to bend the knee. I think he wants to be the biggest dog in the party. And anything he can do to perpetuate that, for all of the reasons we understand. There are some political considerations. There are just personal considerations, because that's how he likes it. When I interviewed him for In Trump's Shadow, I asked him if there was anybody, should he decide not to run, to which, he responded, "Why do you think I'm not going to run?" I said, "I didn't say you're not going to run." But when I asked him, in case you don't, who else can do what you do? He didn't want any part of that. He didn't want to talk about his kids. He didn't want to talk about Republicans that he actually does like. He said, nobody can do what I do. And he wants to preserve that image as long as possible for a whole host of reasons. I think for Republicans who are planning to run for president anyway, and Senator Scott could be one of them, Mike Pompeo is another, Vice President Mike Pence is yet another, the best thing you can do is just talk as though you assume Trump is running, even if you think he might not. And he's hinting that he's going to run, so it's not going to be a surprise if he does. But even if you secretly think to yourself, this guy's too old, he's not going to run, the best way to keep him out, to keep him off your back, is just to say, he's the biggest dog in the room. Yeah, I totally expect him to run, and I'm not getting in the way of that. There'll be plenty of time for that later. None of these other Republicans are going to do anything major before the midterm elections. They actually want Republican majorities in Congress. They care about a lot of these policies, and they're hoping to earn chits with voters by doing the work to get Republicans elected. And by the way, if they can earn those chits by traveling to New Hampshire, Iowa, South Carolina, Wisconsin, Ohio, well, they're already doing that, so it's a twofer.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it's so interesting to see kind of who these candidates are campaigning for and where, certainly. I want to get a little bit more into that, because in your article for the Washington Examiner, as I mentioned, you write that Republican strategists are concerned about Trump announcing before the midterms. What reasons did they give you about why they're worried about it?
Yeah, and Caitlin, this is an important point here. They didn't say they necessarily care that Trump runs or not runs. They're not necessarily scared of him running, although many of them would prefer a fresh face as a nominee in 2024. Their issue is timing. Biden is on the ropes. Inflation is the biggest issue. Democrats are demoralized. Maybe not Democrats everywhere, not Democrats in Congress necessarily, but if you look at polling, Democratic enthusiasm is down. Republicans have won big majorities in the past when they were losing the congressional generic ballot by a little. Here they're actually winning the congressional generic ballot by a little. So they feel like they have the wind at their back, and there's no need to inject Trump, who could galvanize Democratic turnout, give voters a way to look at this election as a choice rather than a referendum on Democratic rule in Washington. And there's just no need for any of that.
Very interesting. Daviducker, thank you. It's always fun to talk about politics with you, even though 2024 seems pretty far away. It's not really, since we see everybody on the trail. Thanks so much for your reporting and for being here.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's good to see you.
And CBS News will have all-day coverage of tomorrow's January 6th committee hearing. It's expected to get underway at 3 p.m. Eastern. We'll have coverage in the lead-up to and after the hearing with our team of correspondents and analysts. You don't want to miss it. You can stream it all right here on CBS News. We'll be right back. You're streaming Red and Blue on CBS News.
I'm
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel. Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Former Vice President Mike Pence criticized President Biden's handling of the economy continuously in a speech earlier this week. One issue he did not address was any conflict with former President Trump regarding the 2020 election. Here's the closest he came to even discussing the events related to January 6th.
You know, we've all been through a lot over the last several years. A global pandemic, social unrest, a divisive election, a tragic day in our nation's capital, and an administration seemingly every day driving our economy into the abyss of a socialist welfare state.
For more, let's bring in Yahoo News national politics reporter Tom Lobianco. He's also the author of the 2019 biography of the former vice president entitled Piety and Power. Hey, Tom, good to see you. Thanks so much for being here. So we saw the former vice president yesterday. He spoke for about 40 minutes, but he made no mention of January 6th and the committee hearings where his attorneys were the ones detailing not only Pence's refusal to go along with Trump's, urging to overturn the presidential election, but also how the former president, really personally insulted him. So what do you make of that dynamic and that kind of disconnect?
Yeah, it is. And thank you, Caitlin. It really is the most jarring contrast right now. I think it was right after that speech, too, where he made the comment that the president that has lied the most is President Biden. And this after we heard extensive testimony from his own counsel, Greg Jacob, one of his advisors, former federal judge Michael Ludig, saying that it was Trump who was lying about this, and ultimately showing how this led up to an attack in the Capitol on January 6th, which really threatened Pence's life and that the lives of his family. His strategy and the tactic that he's been doing throughout all this, and we've seen this hesitation from him in previous campaign stops. He's been kind of tiptoeing around January 6th. Now it seems to be that he's trying to walk past it. And I guess the question here, and certainly the question that I have is, is that feasible? Is that something realistic? This is a definitional moment in his life and career, perhaps the definitional moment. Recall that Greg Jacobs testified under oath that Pence said that when he wrote that letter on January 6th, detailing his inability to overturn the election results, his inability to throw out electors and receive these fake electors that Trump was pushing, that it was probably the most significant thing he will ever sign in his entire life. Contrast that against his 2024 machinations right now, going to the University of Chicago club on Monday and saying, hey, this was a tragic day in our nation's history, and leaving it at that. I don't know if that's going to work for him.
Yeah, that's such an interesting dynamic, the idea that he could be kind of touting this move that even Democrats are kind of calling courageous, yet wants to kind of put it in the rear view and focus on the economy and inflation and kind of traditional Republican issues. I want to get to a little bit more about Pence's potential ambitions in a moment, but I kind of want to take a little bit of a step back to this rally in Georgia. And I remember covering this at the time in Georgia. It was January 4th, 2021. Listen to what former Vice President Pence said then.
We all got our doubts about the last election. And I want to assure you, I share the concerns of millions of Americans about voting irregularities. And I promise you, come this Wednesday, we'll have our day in Congress. We'll hear the objections. We'll hear the evidence.
So, Tom, given what we know from the hearings, given what his, closest advisors and lawyer testified under oath, Pence probably, had to have known at that point that there was no such evidence for what he was describing. And, his lawyers testified to that, that he had already been pushing back on this Trump pressure not to certify the election. So how do you think, how do you essentially reconcile, those words with what had happened 48 hours later?
Reconciling Pence statements is turned into like a lifetime job, I think, for me. I don't know. The short answer is that you don't, right? What it reminded me of, there's, of course, your colleague at CBS, Bob Costa, and Bob Woodward wrote about this, the Dan Quayle exchange, where he was trying to get out of having to do this on January 6th. What it reminded me of, and I wrote about this in the book, there are two events from even earlier, in 2016 and 2015 in Pence's career. In 2015, he has this big meeting right after the whole river blow up, which seemed to would have derailed his career at that moment. Before he goes on George Stephanopoulos and gives one of the most terrible interviews he's ever given. Basically, it seems at that point to have killed his career. He had a meeting at the governor's mansion with a small group of top aides, and I talked with a lot of them for the book, and they all came out of the meeting with different interpretations of what Pence said he was going to do.
It's clear that he has his eyes on a presidential run, and I just find it fascinating that unlike some of these other potential 2024 candidates, he's not being deferential to Trump at all. So I'm kind of curious about that strategy, what you make of it, but also what is the Pence constituency in a 2024 primary, Republican primary, given that, he doesn't have this relationship with Donald Trump anymore? I mean, does he need Trump supporters to kind of gain any traction within the Republican Party if he does decide to run?
Well, this is the key question for him right now. It's the key question for anybody looking at 2024, but it's particularly him. I look at the polling numbers that have come out routinely since January of last year, since the attack, frankly, and Pence has been very steady, kind of like a second or third option right behind Trump. If Trump does running neck and neck with DeSantis, his numbers have not been moving in any serious way. And this gets to your question of the constituency. It seems to be older. It seems to be Midwestern. It seems to be evangelical. You see him playing a lot more to the evangelical Christian right. Groups that he'd gotten away from when he was the governor of Indiana and kind of reconnected with when he was with Trump. But it's not clear right now if this, when you look at those numbers and you see him at like 12% support in a hypothetical 2024 field, you don't know whether or not that's a ceiling or a floor for him.
So I guess we'll kind of keep an eye on his travels, whether he starts making these trips to Iowa, New Hampshire, we'll get a better picture. But I know that we will be talking to you a lot over the next several months and in the lead up to 2024. Tom Lobianco, thank you so much for your time and your reporting.
Thank you, Caitlin.
That does it for today. You can stream Red and Blue Monday through Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And a reminder, if you want to watch previous episodes of the program, you can see them anytime on the CBS News website. Just head to cbsnews.com/redandblue.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.